Hello and welcome to KQED Newsroom. I'm Marisa Lagos, filling in for Tuivu this week. Coming up on our program, a special KQED investigation into October's deadly Northern California wildfires found troubling lapses in the emergency response system. Plus, learn what steps you can take to protect your digital privacy amid the latest cybersecurity threats. But first, Scott Schaefer leads a discussion on local politics. San Francisco's Board of Supervisors replaced acting Mayor London Breed with Mark Farrell, a venture capitalist who represents some of the city's wealthiest neighborhoods. And Governor Jerry Brown delivered his final State of the State address with optimism and a warning.
Despite what is widely believed by some of the most powerful people in Washington, the science of climate change is not in doubt. The National Academies of Science of every major country in the world, including Russia and China, have all endorsed the mainstream view that human-caused greenhouse gases are trapping heat in the oceans and in the atmosphere, and that action must be taken to avert catastrophic changes in our weather systems. All nations agree except one, and that is solely because of one man, our current president. Here in California, we follow a different path. Enlightened by top scientists at the University of California, Stanford, and Caltech, among others, our state has led the way.
Scott Schaefer is next.
Joining Marisa and me to talk about Governor Brown and San Francisco's new interim mayor are San Francisco Magazine editor and columnist at Mission Local, Joe Eskenazi, and University of San Francisco professor James Taylor. Welcome, everybody. Well, it was a very emotional and quite dramatic week at the Board of Supervisors. Joe, you were there. Tell us what happened and what it says about where we are right now in San Francisco politics.
Well, what I wrote was that it was a deeply ugly scene, and it was that, and it was a very counterintuitive and contradictory outcome in which the left-leaning bloc of supervisors, at this moment in American history, unseated a black woman, a city native who worked her way up from the projects, and a lot of personal strife to become acting mayor, and unseated her in favor of a white venture capitalist who grew up in the marina and is the son of a lawyer.
Is that what you mean when you say ugly?
Well, the ugliness was the incredibly heartfelt and angry reaction of the crowd, which was largely her supporters, many of whom are also African American, grew up with her in the Western Addition, and saw this as part and parcel of a pattern of disenfranchisement and frankly racism. The reason I say it was counterintuitive is that in order to the left-leaning bloc of supervisors couched this as a blow against white billionaires who are backing her campaign, and in order to stifle a white billionaire, they elevated a white millionaire.
James, is there more at play here, though?
Well, I think part of the calculation that these supervisors had to consider before they did this is the deep racial history of this city. Maybe these people are too young to remember some of it going back 40 years, but there's been an ongoing sort of sense amongst the African Americans in San Francisco that the city's neglected it overall. And this goes from, going back to Gavin Newsom, Willie Brown, even before that, going back to a promise of the real agenda.
Joe Alioto.
That was never fulfilled. And so, I mean, we can go back all the way to Justin Herman and redevelopment.
Yeah. But Marisa, also, this is about mayoral politics.
Well, right. And I think that that's the thing. I think London Breed supporters did try to couch this, in racial and gender terms for good reasons. I mean, those are all true statements, everything that's been said. On the other hand, you did have Ron Conway, who is a tech billionaire, who was really leaning hard on people, apparently, according to some board members, making threats against them if they didn't support London Breed. You had this concern about, I mean, the biggest issue for the progressives, obviously, is they did not want to give her the power of incumbency going into this June election. But I also think that there was concerns about the fact that as acting mayor, if she had remained as acting mayor, not interim mayor, she would have also simultaneously held the Board of Supervisors presidency. And so during
a time that they're putting the budget together. And
$9 billion she would have controlled by herself.
Yeah, and I think too, a lot of people on her, sort of who back her, have told me that she too was turned off by the things Conway and apparently former Mayor Willie Brown were doing on her behalf, but she never stood up and said that publicly. And so I do think it complicated matters.
Well, and Joe, to what extent was London Breed embracing the tech community and Willie Brown and Ron Conway, whose name suddenly became huge during this hearing? I don't know if anybody knew who he was. I mean, the insiders do, but to what extent was she embracing them back?
That's the million-dollar question. And
or billion-dollar question.
I think that Marisa hit the nail on the head. Her silence spoke volumes. And, you know, back in 2010, when London Breed was running for District 5 supervisor and Willie Brown was portrayed as her controller, she responded to that in very harsh terms. She said things that I cannot say here on television. And that didn't happen this time. Yeah. And whether that was, you know, whether that was something that was heartfelt or was for show or both, that didn't happen this time.
But to what extent do you think that was because, in a sense, she's behind in this mayor's race? Suddenly we have this compressed calendar. Mark Leno, who's also running, openly gay man, had raised about $400,000. I mean, did you think she felt like, well, if I'm going to win in June or come in second in, you know, whatever, ranked choice voting, I have to do this because they're my ticket to the mayor's office?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's probably a consideration. You know, I think you do have to give London some credit here. The last month and a half for her has probably been extraordinary and very difficult. The mayor died suddenly in the middle of the night. She was, this, you know, role of acting mayor was foisted upon her. She did, I would say, by all accounts, really rise to the occasion. But, you know, with that came these politics that immediately started and this question of what was going to happen in June. And so, could you make the argument that she might have been able to distance herself a little publicly but still maintain their support? Well, it's likely, but I do think there's been a lot of complicating factors.
One thing we haven't talked about is who cast the deciding vote. Right. It's Jeff Sheehy, who was a supervisor who took Scott Wiener's place, represents the Castro, openly gay, appointed by Ed Lee. He had been in the moderate camp, but he flipped to help.
Yes and no. After the vote, Jeff Sheehy told me that that the situation, as Marisa put it, was untenable. You can't be the head of the legislative branch and the executive branch at the same time, and it didn't look like we were budging on that. And there had been delay after delay on this vote, and London has had that odd and untenable dual role for 6 weeks. Jeff Sheehy actually did vote for London Breed to be interim mayor, but only 3 other people did. And then he voted for for Mark as well. And then he was the deciding vote.
But James, you know, there was a lot of talk at the board on Tuesday that we've never had an African-American woman as mayor, but we've never had an Asian-American woman. Jane Kim is running for mayor. We've never had an openly gay mayor. Mark Leno is running. So the identity politics here are really...
They're real and I think thick. And I think for that reason, at the neighborhood level, this move on London Breed reflects, you know, at the ground level too. What do the constituents of these supervisors prefer? So we're sort of looking at how London Breed's supporters reacted. We're not considering that Jane Kim and these other supervisors had to go to that meeting that evening with, you know, carrying out the will of their voters, and it may have been very much consistent with the way they voted. I think it's real quickly important to note that, you know, for those who sort of see this as a racial act, you know, again, I think there is race involved in here, but these are the same people that elected London Breed, many of them, to become the supervisor unanimously twice. So did they become racist in the last January? They voted for her, January 17th, a second time, to be their leader. They have some respect for her, and she's apparently been able to get these people behind her, but now it's different.
But not now.
I just want to move on, Jim. I'm sorry, because we want to talk about the state of the state, too. So we're going to shift from San Francisco to Sacramento. You were up there this week, Marisa, for the state of the state, Jerry Brown's 16th and, I think, final state of the state address. What was the mood there, and was it just a victory lap for him, or what was your most important takeaway, do you think?
Yeah, I would say that it was, and I think that, you know, the mood in the chambers was very sort of positive. I think even Republicans have a lot of deference and respect for Jerry Brown. And so, you know, he arrived in the chambers to just massive applause. He had a lot of sort of laugh lines, a little bit of riffing in his speech. And really, he spent most of his speech talking about how far the state's come over the last 7 years. And I think sort of defending his most important initiatives in an attempt to make sure that, you know, in this final year, they don't get rolled back and that he has an opportunity to sort of see some of them through.
And some of those things being things like high-speed rail and the Delta tunnels. You know, he doesn't like the word legacy, James. He resists that word, but how much of his legacy is resting on what happens in this final year?
Well, I think Jerry Brown's legacy has been etched in stone. I think he has a favorite son, a native son relationship with this state that is unprecedented, and there's not likely to be another person like Jerry Brown in the future. He's one of a kind for this state, given his relationship to his father, to having been governor in the 70s, now governor again,
mayor of
Oakland, attorney general, professor at USF, right? You know, and Jerry Brown, you know, has become almost I wrote an op-ed piece recently where he's almost like the George Wallace of the climate change, you know, position.
Whoa.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost it's a flip on things. Like Donald Trump is the threat, and Jerry Brown's become this sort of blue state champion of climate change in the way that Wallace was with segregation, and it's a real powerful thing.
Joe, of course, one of the contenders, leading contender really, to take Jerry Brown's place is Gavin Newsom, former mayor here in San Francisco. They've had a tense relationship at times, Jerry Brown. They initially were opponents running against each other until Gavin Newsom ran for lieutenant governor. What do you make of this sort of shift of power from L.A., you know, up to San Francisco? Kamala Harris is from here, Dianne Feinstein, Jerry Brown, now Gavin Newsom, the front runner. I mean, what does that say, do you think, about how politics in California have changed? That's a big question, I understand.
There's more money up here,
yeah,
and there's more voters up here. Yeah. You know, I mean,
actual voters.
Yes, actual
people who
voters.
turn out and cast ballots. Yeah.
So it's not a huge surprise, you know, and there's a level of insurgency for Southern California that they wanted some of that back. And I know a lot of people who are not fans of Gavin Newsom that would still support him because he is Northern Californian, and they feel that he will bring the bacon back to Northern California as opposed to Southern California. So the rivalry is real.
Just about a minute left, but Marisa, I know that we talked to the governor in his office a couple of weeks ago, and he was talking about making olive oil on the ranch. So he's got one foot in retirement. But quickly, criminal justice, which you cover all the time, is also going to be a big part of his legacy, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think part of his speech yesterday was really defending, you know, pleading with lawmakers, hey, I know that realignment and some of these big shifts have been tough, but let's not roll them back, give it a chance. The thing I have my eye on this year is bail reform. Does the governor back that? Do they find the money?
And of course, the gas tax repeal as well. He's promising to fight that if it makes it to the ballot. Thank you all so much. We could, I think, talk for another half an hour, but we're out of time.
Easy.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Turning now to a special investigation of the North Bay fire response. As flames sped across Sonoma County on the night of October 8th, calls flooded into 911. Overwhelmed operators gave conflicting information about whether to evacuate or not. KQED analyzed hundreds of hours of 911 calls and found troubling gaps in the emergency response system meant to keep the public safe. I reported on this together with my colleagues who join me now, KQED criminal justice reporter Suki Lewis and KQED data reporter Lisa Pickoff-White. So one of our main findings after months of talking to people and listening to these calls was about evacuation orders. Lisa, what did we learn about what happened in those early hours in Sonoma County and how quickly they were able to respond to these fires?
Yeah, so we found several calls where CAL FIRE was calling up Sonoma County officials and asking them to call people through reverse 911s and warn them that there was a fire coming. However, we found that those calls didn't go out for an hour after the request.
So basically you're saying there's this delay between when firefighters thought that people should be leaving their homes and they actually were told to do so.
Exactly.
And was there a reason for this delay that we know of?
So I think part of it comes down to just the overwhelm of the night. Like, first responders were out in the streets. They were doing everything they could. They were responding to, like, fires were basically popping up everywhere, and it was kind of like whack-a-mole. They couldn't get on top of it fast enough. And so I think there was this delay in a recognition of the nature of the disaster that was happening. And then it also got to this issue of process, where they're calling, the firefighter has to call from the field and let the main CAL FIRE station know what's happening. Then the main dispatcher there is calling another dispatch center, and then that information is getting relayed to law enforcement, because law enforcement are the only ones who have the actual authority to ask people to leave their homes and evacuate. And so all that process, that takes time, especially when everyone is kind of freaking out.
Right, and as you pointed out, what we found was that there's so many players and so much going on. I want to play one call that I think illustrates the frustration the public ran into because of this chaos.
Just from our house, it looks like no one's calling it in. It's just getting worse and worse and worse. We don't hear any sirens.
So, ma'am, this is actually going to be CAL FIRE's jurisdiction. Let me give you their phone number. I know they are working several fires.
Are you kidding me? This is 911. I'm supposed to call somebody else?
No, ma'am. This is if you're reporting a fire, it's going to be CAL FIRE who responds out there. But
okay, what's the number,
they may be working a fire in that area. I'm not aware of it.
So you can hear there the frustration in this woman's voice. I should say this was a call around 10 o'clock to Napa 911, and she's basically being told, call CAL FIRE. I mean, Lisa, do you think, I feel like as a member of the public, we think that there's maybe this sort of cohesive system. It seems like this shows some pretty big gaps in that.
Yeah, one of the things we found is that often there's different people who deal with different situations, and since CAL FIRE there has the jurisdiction to fight fires, they're the ones who actually need the phone calls when people tell you that there is a fire going on, so they can find it and then decide whether or not to send responders to it. And that's what's going on in that call. But one of the things we also learned from just listening to all of these calls is that there's kind of this vicious cycle that's happening where people really want information. They see flames, they smell smoke, and they want to know what to do. Should they evacuate? So they do what we're taught to do, right? Even as kids, we call 911. Except then 911 gets completely overwhelmed, and they actually can't take really important calls, like people being trapped in their houses and stuff like that. And also, it makes it harder for officials and 911 operators themselves to actually get out that public information. And so then more people just keep calling 911.
Right. And Suki, you and I got to go actually visit one of these dispatch centers in Sonoma County. We talked to the director there. It was all hands on deck. And I do think one thing we've talked about a lot as we reported this is that we want to point out the systematic problems here, not blame individuals, because these people were doing everything they possibly could.
Yes, and like we met with Aaron Abbott at Redcom, the Sonoma Dispatch Center, and they were dealing with this emergency in their own way. Like they, the room filled with smoke because they're, they lost power. They had to go on generator power, and so they're in the dispatch center trying to manage this emergency.
They almost had to evacuate.
They almost had to evacuate themselves. And I think this gets at kind of the nature of how widespread this was, and that it really took people by surprise.
I mean, we also talked to a lot of people who did escape, even though they didn't get these evacuation orders. Lisa, can you just give me a flavor of the types of stories we heard from these fire victims?
Yeah, we've heard a lot of people, like you said, who didn't find out from officials. Some people got phone calls from friends. Of course, we've heard about a lot of local heroes who knocked on people's doors. And then some people just didn't know. And I think one of the scariest stories we heard was of a man who escaped with his elderly mother. He had actually checked the CAL FIRE website at 11 p.m., didn't find any information. And then at 2 in the morning, had to get his 86-year-old mother in the car, and they drove through flames, over power lines, were blocked eventually by burnt out cars, had to go back and try to find another way out. It was very frightening. I mean, people told us they really thought they were going to die. And unfortunately, some did.
Yeah. And I think people are upset. Like, I think that's what we've all seen and heard in talking to people. They're like, people are upset and in trauma and processing this, but I think we're also hearing that changes are coming.
Right. I want to get to that. I know that, as we've learned, this is a multi-county, multi-jurisdictional process. But I know there are a couple things kind of percolating. One is a piece of state legislation that would basically force a more cohesive response system. Suki, I know next week federal officials are taking this up. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah. So the FCC is looking at this now. This has been kind of a big topic. Like, some Sonoma officials have been in hot water for the type of alert they chose to use. They use this kind of limited alert called a SOCO alert. That's, the technology is, that's the name of the technology. But anyway, that's what will call you on your landline. But that's only landlines, and it's very limited in scope.
Not everyone has them.
And not everyone has them. And then there was the Nixle alerts, which are opt-in. And again, as you know, with pretty much anything where the public has to opt into it, not that many people do. Right. And so there is this kind of third piece of technology called a wireless emergency alert, and that's hijacks your phone and will basically kind of make some kind of beeping noise.
This is Amber Alerts, right? Exactly, an example of those.
Exactly. And so the Sonoma officials decided not to use this. They didn't even consider using this because there are some limitations with it. And even as these fires were still burning, Feinstein and Harris were like calling federal officials at the FCC and saying, like, can you do something? Can you make these alerts more effective? And so they're finally kind of taking up this, basically new regulations that would require wireless providers to make these alerts more effective and, maybe save lives.
Great. Lisa, quickly, what's next for this investigation? a lot more work. But you know, I mean, I think this was one story we're doing,
yes.
but we plan on rolling out many more.
Yes, so we're looking more at what happened that night. We're looking at how all these jurisdictions work together, since, I mean, disasters don't care where you live or who's in charge.
Right.
And we're also looking at exactly these communication issues. And what we've heard from a lot of officials is that they recognize that there were problems that night and they're working to change that.
Great. Suki Lewis, Lisa Pickoff-White, thank you ladies for joining me.
Thank you.
Turning now to high tech, California lawmakers want to preserve net neutrality through legislation that would push back on the Trump administration's recent FCC ruling. And as data theft becomes increasingly common, cybersecurity experts are urging people to take steps to protect their devices and personal information. To talk about this and more, my next guest is Cisco's Chief Privacy Officer, Michelle Dennedy. Michelle, thanks so much for coming in.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, as I mentioned, protecting our data and privacy is something that we're hearing a lot more about as these breaches become more common. But it also means giving up other things, like, you know, not having to look for 5,000 passwords all the time.
Exactly.
How do you think people should strike a balance between, you know, these considerations of sort of ease of life and really not wanting to end up in a situation where all of your information's out there?
Well, I love your language already. So it really is about striking a balance. So don't be so offended by passwords that you pick really dumb ones, or your like password or 123 or I love you, which is very sweet, but not for your password.
Yeah.
Because then you're still inconvenienced by putting it in, but you're not using any of the protection. So number one, think about it as a balance. So the first thing I would say to any consumer in particular, and what I practice at Cisco, is really looking at what are your data assets. And what I mean by that is really, what are you trying to do with your device? Are you calling your kids? Are you banking? Are you booking a medical appointment? Those things are different data transactions. And I want you to start by understanding that they're there and that there's a way for you to take control of that balance sheet, that data balance sheet.
So it seems like what you're saying is maybe your banking app might need a stronger password than something else that's more just sort of for fun.
I hope so, but having a bad password on any of these things is a great way for social engineering and other ways in. But think about it even more broadly. So if you're using a banking pass application on your phone or on your laptop, maybe want to think about, if you don't have a VPN or some other personal hotspot, don't do it in a coffee shop. Think about doing it in a secure environment. Same thing when you're on the go and you're trying to communicate with your kids. Do you need location on for what you're doing? Or do you want location on because you want to know where your kids are doing?
Right.
So think about it really in context of, first, what's your objective? What information do you need? And then try to limit the stuff that you don't need, that isn't really adding to your data asset, if you will.
I mean, because it's kind of crazy. It's like every website you enter wants you to sign up and create a password and do these things. So it can get overwhelming. I want to talk to you about another aspect. I know you're a mom and you have teenage kids, so you're really in this. I have very young kids. I'm curious how you think people should be approaching this with their children. And I'm thinking about, you know, their access to the internet, but also you see people who put their entire kids' lives on social media.
Yes, yes. I mean, if this was vodka, I'd be drinking it in the morning. Yes, you want to really think about starting to talk to your kids as soon as they're talking to you, because you're seeing children in restaurants as young as 1 and 2 swiping and doing things.
And they're digital natives. It's like they understand these devices better than we do sometimes.
They understand the technology and the fun and games. They don't have your judgment. So what I always say to parents is, yes, it's overwhelming. The teens in particular, they change their passwords like they change their minds. Their passwords. I wish they changed their passwords that often. They change the applications that they're playing with like they change their mind. And so you may not be able to keep up with the latest and the greatest cool thing, but you can say things like, did you know that there are certain things you can never change? Your fingerprints, for example. Children as young as 5 years old, I've gone into their classrooms and said, this is you all the time. I was born with a different name. I assumed a different name as I grew up and grew older. So some stories change and some stay the same. And so you start, that's all the little ones need. When you get to the age, that critical age, when they're still speaking to you, but almost not, so your tweens and teens, that's when you really want to dig in on ethics conversations and use items in the news. So talk about, Kamala Harris, when she was here as our AG in California, she really went on a mission to look at predators online. What does it mean to take selfies and nudes and all these things that kids think are private? That's happening to kids as young as 11 and 12. Wow. So don't think you can wait till high school to tackle some of these morality and ethics issues. And then please talk to your fellow parents and let them know that a picture of your child with the name, with a picture of your car and the license plate in front of the school, probably way over budget on the data.
Yeah, those are hard conversations. I want to turn to another sort of difficult conversation we've been having as a society, which is this Me Too movement, talking about women. I feel like the tech industry, this issue's been percolating around diversity and gender, but it hasn't maybe come to the surface quite as much as it has in, say, entertainment and other industries. What's it like being a woman in tech, and do you think that Silicon Valley needs to have more of a Me Too moment?
Oh my gosh. Okay, so I won't get too crazy, but I put a hashtag up when that whole came out.
I mean, most of us did, right? That's why it's so...
I know one woman who said that she's never had any sort of discriminatory behavior, we'll put it that way, mildly. And I've been in tech, in different segments of tech for the last 30 years. I think Silicon Valley is good and ready to out not just the bad guys, because quite honestly, they're open secrets. Who I really want to out in Silicon Valley are the men who are enablers, the men who give us a voice at the table. I have a great boss, and I probably shouldn't say it on TV. It's like the ultimate brown-nose moment. But John Stewart is the Chief Trust Officer for Cisco, and I tell you what, he's an advocate for women. He's an advocate for people from different economic backgrounds. And I think what we hope to do is, if you look at the percentage of men in control, 97% of them white males.
Right.
If every one of them could be turned into an enabler, this would not be a generation by the time your children and mine got to be our age. So don't focus so much on the bad stuff.
Right.
Enable the enablers.
Totally. I think that's something everybody's talking about.
Yeah.
Michelle Dennedy, thank you so much for coming in tonight.
Thank you. It goes by fast with you. You're really great.
Thank you. And that does it for us. You can find more of our coverage at kqed.org/newsroom. I'm Marisa Lagos. Thanks for joining us.